catch up. It records a local version. So, Dr. Mark, I want to start again. Dr. Mark Wagner, welcome to the Astroben podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. Well, it's we're coming up to the I don't know what it's like in the US, but it's coming up to school holidays. So I thought it'd be a good time to have a space educator on to talk about education of all things. Um, and I heard about you for a few people, actually. A few people said, oh, you've got to talk to Mark. There's a lot of stuff I talk about on the podcast is about inspiring young people to look up at the stars, not down at their phones, and how we can believe as a society that we will one day potentially be working and living in space. And obviously, education is a key part of that. So what inspired you to become a space educator? And do you identify as a space educator for starters?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always a good time to talk about space education and inspiring kids. So happy to share, I suppose, my trajectory here, if you will. But I'm a lifelong space enthusiast. I went to space camp a couple times as a kid. I originally studied astronautical engineering as an undergrad. But like everybody else in the 90s, to date myself, I jumped ship, only instead of jumping to mechanical engineering or civil engineering, like a lot of my colleagues, I jumped all the way to studying literature and philosophy. So I taught high school English right out the gate, but real quickly got reconnected with the other side of my brain and got involved with education technology initiatives. And so I had a 20-year education technology career there, focused on training teachers to use technology in meaningful ways. So I would say maybe we're looking at our phones and we're looking up at the stars is a pretty great combination. And maybe I'll have some stories to that effect today. But it was really it was an incredible ride. I did a lot of work with Google for Education in particular, helped run the Google Teacher Academy on and off, and it's all its successors for a number of years. We ran a whole bunch of conference style events in the decade before COVID. And as crazy as it sounds, we ran about 100 conferences a year, about 400 or 500 other workshops a year in dozens of countries around the world. So that was a hell of a ride. But right about the year before COVID, started to think about what was next for me and starting to focus back in on space. Clearly, if you look at the headlines, space is really exciting right now, and that can be an opportunity for engaging kids. In fact, there's research to show that it is. So I think the time is absolutely right for capturing kids' imaginations, preparing them for the growing space economy, preparing them for humanity's rapidly approaching multi-planet future. And that's everything my work is focused on now is space education. So I absolutely identify as a space educator today.
Yeah, it's fantastic. You mentioned using technology to inspire kids and adults as well. Um, what role do you think technology plays in shaping the future of space education? Because I look at the news this week, and the new Apple Vision Pro goggles are sort of going viral, and you see slightly bizarre videos of people on buses and driving driverless cars with these goggles on and potentially sort of learning on the go. Do you think technology like that is going to make it more impactful or a different way of learning, perhaps to see a launch and that sort of thing, bringing space
I kind
closer
of
to
have
people?
I have a couple of different responses to that might be interesting for your listeners. Uh, the first, though, is that I don't think that's really where the rubber meets the road, and it probably won't be for a long time when it comes to the real value for students and teachers in an educational context. That's kind of a theme that's familiar to me. Having worked in education technology for several decades, what I'm more interested in are tools that give kids the opportunity to open-ended tools that give them the opportunity to create, edit, remix, publish, share, those sorts of things. So where, let's say 10 years ago, to draw a stark contrast, we had something like Google Glass available. It seemed like the future, but there wasn't very much you could do with it. Where Google Docs was much, much more exciting because here's an open-ended tool that allowed kids to create collaboratively and edit and share and publish on the web. So those kinds of open-ended tools allowing kids to do the heavy lifting and allowing them to create are much more interesting to me. For example, when you talk about space education, sure, there's a handful of VR applications out there, and there have been for a number of years. You can take a great VR tour of the International Space Station, for instance, but that's kind of not a whole lot different from, say, an encyclopedia article on a
Right.
space station. Whereas, using something like Slew, which I mentioned earlier, is a tool I'm really excited about and thrilled to be representing now. This is a platform that allows students and teachers to schedule time on telescopes around the world. So now, instead of learning about astronomers, they're learning to be astronomers. They're learning to think like astronomers. They're doing astronomy, and they can look up at something in the sky and then turn around and go to a device as simple as a Chromebook
Mm.
and schedule time on a telescope and either watch it live or come back the next morning when they're back in school, for instance, and they log in and there's their images that they ordered the night before. So I really do think that that combination is a great illustration of something totally new. Using a telescope, first of all, is going to be useless during a school day. You got
Yeah.
to get kids
Right.
to come back at night or do it on their own at night. And second of all, is really difficult with a really limited payoff. And the number of us that have 20-inch telescopes or whatever it is fairly limited. Whereas if you can use a web-based tool to easily schedule time looking at the things that you care about and see them live or see them within that day, and learn about them in a relatively firsthand way. That's suddenly really powerful. Putting an observatory in the hands of kids,
Absolutely.
um, and that builds. That's nothing you could ever see with the naked eye looking up at Orion. You're not going to see the Orion Nebula without the help of a pretty powerful telescope. So that's a good example, I think, of doing both.
No, I like that. And so you mentioned SLU, and I'll put a link to SLU in the show notes. Does that stand for anything, first of all? And then also,
I know
how
it's
does
interesting.
it just sounds
I
like
wondered
a
that.
yeah.
I wondered that myself for a long time. I was like, oh, wait, what is it? Why is it named Slew? It's a unique name and it's Googleable, but it's sort of a deliberate misspelling of SLEW.
Mm.
The site is SLOOH, which is a platform to allow kids to schedule time on telescopes. But SLEW would be the verb you would use for rotating a telescope to a new field of view. So where you would slew the telescope, it sounds just like the name for the online tool. Yeah.
Absolutely. And how does SLU cater to students with varying levels of interest and expertise in space science? Because
Oh, that's great.
because obviously, and also how does it cater to educators as well? Is it more focused towards the students or the educators, or a bit of both?
That's really great. Those are great questions. And there's layers to it. At the student level, there's the obvious interest of being able to look up at something in the sky and then order a picture of it, or being able to go to a list of they have a list of the SLU 1000 or the SLU 100 like most interesting things to look at in the sky. So you can very easily find your way to a pretty
Mm.
spectacular looking nebula or star cluster or something, or galaxy for that matter. Um, then there's layers of sort of gamification. You can get gravity points, they call them, and you can collect items on the SLU 1000, that kind of thing. But if you go deeper, there are quests for the kids. So there's a quest related to the Apollo landings with tons of additional standards aligned, learning opportunities around taking some pictures of the moon. There's a number of much more sophisticated guides on certain astronomical topics, like what is an emission nebula versus a reflection nebula, or what are the types of galaxies, um, and so or even what are the different types of telescopes that you're operating, and what are the conditions that you might be operating in terms of weather and dew points and altitude and things like that.
Mm.
So it kind of gets progressively deeper if you really want to go deeper. So it's fantastic for engaging kids in elementary school. It's certainly perfectly aligned with the quests and everything for a middle school situation. But they teach high school astronomy courses through it. They teach undergraduate astronomy courses through it. I imagine more sophisticated astronomers could put it to good use too, but all of that's built into the system now. And it's kind of been a slow burn for them. They've been at it for 20 odd years. So there's a real depth to it. One of the things they don't even advertise that I love is if you're watching the satellites live, the exposures are all for 5 minutes.
Mm.
And you'll see it go from sort of perhaps a grainy black and white image to a sharper, more colorful image if you're looking at, say, a nebula or something like that that's got color to it. And during those 5 minutes, many of the objects have a pre-recorded 5-minute lecture um, from a world-renowned astronomer. So you can sit there and listen to Bob Berman or Helen Avery talking about the Orion Nebula or Andromeda Galaxy or what a barred spiral galaxy is, that sort of thing. What makes a emission nebula? So there's just a lot of depth there. On the teacher end, they have workspaces that are similar to a classroom environment. They sync with certain student information systems, sync with Google Classroom, that kind of thing. So there's some management tools built into. You can assign a quest to a whole class and check up on everybody's progress.
Fantastic. I do love how the US has all these initiatives and incentives to get people looking up at the stars. Because you go to the UK, the idea of a space camp or a telescope time, it's just it's very much probably a niche for some of the top schools, but not very accessible anywhere
Well, it's
else.
interesting. Well, obviously, if you've got an online tool like SLU, that's available globally, really anywhere they can get online. But also the Aldrin Family Foundation, which is based out of Florida and has giant maps like the one behind me. I know your listeners can't see it, but we can certainly talk about it a little bit more. That program also is found all over the world. There's schools using it, and there's a really great implementation out of Sunderland University. They've got a number of maps there that they get out into the elementary schools in the region. So there's dozens of schools in the UK through that implementation and others that are using the giant moon map and giant Mars map from the Aldrin Family Foundation too.
That's fantastic. And
Yeah.
as I mentioned, I've had the honor of having Andy Aldrin on the podcast, which
Oh yeah.
was super cool. But what's your perspective of working with the Aldrin Family Foundation? Because I imagine Andy, has obviously been on the leadership team, but also has the added responsibility of the name, and probably getting asked questions all the time about that sort of things, like he did when he came on this podcast. Which you obviously have a different perspective, and you're the director of education partnerships. So how does that work? Where do you look to start partnerships, and what's your sort of strategy for the Aldrin Family Foundation?
Oh yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think first of all, Andy's perspective is always going to be different, and you've probably heard him talk about it. People ask him, "What's it like having an astronaut for a dad?" And he's like, "Hey, everybody on my street had an astronaut for a dad."
Right.
uh, but Andy's, he probably doesn't talk about his own qualifications that much, but his graduate degrees range across business and public policy, and he runs Embry-Riddle's space operations master's program right now, which is growing tremendously fast. It's very popular and effective. So he's a great expertise to have, at the head of the family foundation. Buzz is 94, not real involved anymore, but Andy is very active. So our team meets with Andy, weekly, if not more, to sort of keep everything running. And we're lucky also to have a guy named Jim Christensen involved, who is a former middle school teacher who about 20 years ago got involved at Johnson Space Center doing the first video conferences to the ISS, between the
Mm.
ISS and students and teachers in classrooms. And he went on to be the director of education at Kennedy Space Center, where he was responsible for, among other things, designing the astronaut training experience, or ATX building there at the Visitors Center. And he's still well connected there. But for the last several years, has been working with Andy, and he wrote most of the curriculum around the giant moon map and giant Mars maps and their summer camps. So it's really been awesome to work with Jim. He's got so much experience with the astronaut training corps and with NASA, and he's, as Andy calls him, one of the OG when it comes to space education. And about the time I joined up last summer too, Dr. Christina Otero joined the team, and she's a former large marine mammal trainer who went
Oh
on to
wow.
teaching science as well, and then got involved with Andy through his space studies program, and now the Aldrin Family Foundation also partially sponsored her PhD, and she studied self-efficacy in students when it comes to science education using Aldrin's programs. So they've brought her on board now, so she has a skill set that really allows her to help align what the Aldrin Foundation has to offer and align those programs with local state standards, locally adopted curriculum, school district pacing guides, that kind of thing. There's a little bit of a white glove service there in terms of looking at what are the district's needs and focus areas,
Hmm.
and finding out where something like a giant map of the moon with robotic rovers can plug into it. And
Absolutely.
speaking as a former high school English teacher, space education isn't just about STEM, like science, technology, engineering, and math. If you're engaging kids, you can be meeting standards all across the curriculum. So I would absolutely, if I was back teaching high school English right now, I would be teaching, nonfiction reading and writing and listening and speaking skills. All of that could be happening through kids' interest in space, which is an interesting point I definitely want to make for your listeners, which is if you look at the two biggest problems in schools today, especially post COVID, one of them, the biggest one, is student disengagement. So kids
Yeah.
kind of have this idea of like, why do I have to go to school for 6 hours and sit in a row and listen to my teachers when I used to just do that online and I could get it done in 90 minutes to 2 hours or something? Because the kids who had the right technology and had the right support, they were able to kind of go at their own speed and knock things out during emergency distance learning. And now that we're back, it's that sort of layers been peeled back, and kids wonder why am I here? And we see statistically, New York City DOE last year had, if I'm remembering the number correctly, 40% of students were chronically absent.
Wow.
And the companion problem across the country is represented by an LAUSD statistic. Last year, they had 70% of LAUSD teachers reported burnout and a desire to leave the profession. So,
Yeah.
a potential solution to both those problems, Unistellar, the telescope company, released a study last year, an independent study of 500. Actually, this is the year before now, so 2022 study, but an independent study of 500 American families across demographics, and they found that 93% of U.S. students are interested in space. So if you're worried about student disengagement and teacher burnout, by the way, one way to re-engage people around something meaningful in their future, instead of looking over their shoulder and remediating on what they missed over the last couple of years, is engaging them in through their interest and excitement about space. And that's not a young or an old, elementary or secondary student thing. It's not a boy or a girl thing.
Hmm.
It's not. It's certainly not a wealth thing or an ethnicity thing. We're talking 93% of kids are excited about space.
Well, it's so. I mean, I can't speak for Americans because I'm not one. But it seems so ingrained into the American psyche. You know, the sort of memories of, we're the only ones that put people on the moon. Still to this day, and you look at companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin. Still pushing the boundaries, and America is definitely it's the place where astronauts were born from. So it's hugely inspiring, and I definitely agree. That's definitely a sort of focal point to tap into, especially when kids are younger. How do you see space education contributing to humanity's future and space exploration? With the NASA Artemis missions and going back to the moon, onto Mars, how how are we going to sort of tap into that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the headlines alone make it easier to tap into that. Like kids are seeing, there's so many firsts happening in space every day, and hopefully kids are having some exposure to that, and schools can help expose them to that.
Mm.
But I look at it in two ways. One is a very pragmatic ways, and the other is a little bit more aspirational. On the pragmatic side, we're really concerned with career readiness, with workforce development, with preparing kids for the growing space economy, whether or not they're going to be explicitly working in the space industry, if you will, right? So if you, it's not just scientists, engineers, and test pilots anymore. If you look at a company like SpaceX or any of the others, they have whole HR departments and marketing departments, and they need designers. They certainly need software engineers. They need all of these things across the board, in addition to welders
Yeah.
and people who can work with composites. There's really, whatever your strengths and interests are as a young person today, if you're also interested in space, there's a place for you in the growing space industry. The flip side of that is, even if you're not working in the space industry, you really need to know what's going on. It's very similar to, if you roll back 20 years, we were having to convince people to talk about the internet in schools,
Yeah.
and now it's a given. Whatever industry you're in, the internet is important. Um, to similarly, so I always joke, if you're working in the shoe industry, you'd better know what kind of new materials developments are coming out of space. You'd better know how your shoe might work with GPS or with a constellation like Starlink, with when it comes to the Internet of Things. What's an always on shoe that knows where it is going to do for you, right? Just as a semi humorous example, whatever industry you're in, it's probably uh, impacted by or going to be impacted by space technologies in the next 10 years, especially if we talk Earth observation satellites. That's already affecting everything from agriculture to crime fighting, right?
I completely
Never
agree.
mind, monitoring and helping the environment.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you can look at any corporate company, McDonald's. I can't think of any companies now. Adidas. You can just put in space after it, and you can see a way that they will jump on the bandwagon.
Yeah.
But what are your sort of thoughts on the role of public-private sort of partnerships in space education? Because do they have some sort of responsibility that space education is in the right way? It's not just jumping on board for the sake of it. Because I
Oh, that's
do see
interesting.
I do see glimmers of that at the moment with some companies sort of not really having a space strategy, but just kind of saying, "Oh, we're doing this in space now," and it's not really there. It doesn't have the hook for educational sense.
It's going to be kind of, I mean, maybe we're going to have some, I don't know, MMA fights in space. There was
I mean, that would be
articles
awesome.
about that a while ago. We've got space Oreos right now, which is largely a marketing effort, I think, more than anything. Good for space perspective too. But uh, I I think I understand what you're asking, and from my perspective, and then we'll get to the aspirational stuff that I didn't get to a minute ago. But from my perspective, particularly having come out of education technology, I think there's a direct line from Apple putting Apple IIs in all our classrooms in the 80s. I think there's a direct line from that to the world's richest company today. A lot of other things went well along the way, but I think the fact that Apple was deliberately winning the hearts and minds of young people paid off in the long run. And I think I got to be a part of seeing that happen for Google.
Yeah.
When I worked on the first Google Teacher Academy in 2006, most teachers had no idea that, say, Google Docs existed, and it barely did. And they didn't know most of what you could do with Google's search tools. And you look at, by 2019, before COVID, they had a 95% market penetration in North America for, the Google Workspace and Chromebooks, which didn't even exist 15 years prior. So I think we're at a similar situation right now where, I was
Mm.
talking about rolling it back 20 years and how important the internet is. If you look forward, 15 years from right now, I think space education is going to be embedded in everything that schools are doing. Like it's just going to be a part of our daily lives, like the internet.
Mm.
And now would be a great time for a company like SpaceX or any of the others in that field um, to really jump into supporting education the way Apple did and the way Google did in previous decades.
Mm.
And I do see some companies. I'm surprised that SpaceX isn't, but they're focused on making rockets. But I do see some companies doing this. Obviously, Club for the Future is a nonprofit arm associated with Blue Origin. Virgin Galactic had their Galactic Unite. Um, Limitless Space Institute has a great program for limitless educators. They're definitely doing it right. But these are all, in my mind, these are sort of small programs compared to what could be happening at a much larger scale. So I'm not sure that really answers your question, but that's kind of my perspective on it. Is at
Yeah.
what point are the private entities with something to gain from it really going to throw their weight into building this pipeline of inspired, empowered, students for their future workforce.
Oh, it's so interesting. I do think this decade we're going to see something. I had oh god, I'm going to forget his name now. Kevin J. De Bruyne.
Mhm.
He's a space educator, and he said he wants to do. Well, he believes there should be a space curriculum, which this was 2 years ago. So I sort of heard. I was like, I don't know if you can make a curriculum out of space, but now it makes so much sense that there's a huge gap in the market for something like
Oh
that
yes,
because
and
and
oh,
no, it's not even a it's not even just a sort of science add-on. It's like it's a subject in itself. You know, how
it
you look at
is.
the world and build businesses focused on space is it's such an opportunity.
So my passion is not uh, government adoption of standards, for instance. Right? Sometimes that flies in the face of open-ended tools that allow kids to be creative. But I did write a book about this, and I did have the opportunity to develop a curriculum around it, and we were. Um, what am I trying to say? We were aspirational in that too. We aimed high. So the book, which I'm holding up, but your listeners can't see, it's called Space Education: Preparing Students for Humanity's Multi-Planet Future, and that's a pretty academic volume. It's a collection of studies and essays that I wrote when I went back to graduate school. I got my PhD in education technology years ago, but I went back for certificates in space education and space philosophy. It's amazing that both of those exist. And I kind of had all my ducks in a row and collected all that work into the book. And the book suggested a curriculum, and I had the opportunity to create that when I was working with the Space Prize Foundation. And I know you were saying you interviewed Kim Masharia before too. But at Space Prize, we built a curriculum targeted at high school students. You could certainly use it with younger students who are motivated and interested. Um, but it looks not only at an introduction to space science and the history of space exploration, it also looks at why space is important to people on Earth today. It
Yeah.
looks at what's happening in the commercial space industry, and it looks further ahead to issues of ethics, governance, sustainability, longer term issues of avoiding existential threats and perhaps uh, rising to our higher aspirations for shepherding Earth life through the solar system and beyond. So that was exciting to make. And if you print it out as a PDF, it's a good 550 pages. It's a legit textbook. We
Mm.
call it a flex book because we released it on the CK12 platform, which is an open education resource. So anybody can use that. In fact, if you go to spaceprize.org um, slash education, I think you'll get there. Or if you go to spaceeducation.org, it will redirect there.
Fantastic. I'll put that in the show notes and a link to the book as well. But you've had an amazing career. I mean, you're I'm sure there's lots of stuff you still want to do. What's your aspirations for the rest of your career? Is there a sort of final goal or project or commitment that you want policymakers to make that's going to affect space education as wide as possible in a positive way?
Boy, that's an interesting question. I think I want to start my answer though by revisiting what I didn't finish saying earlier, which is, if the pragmatic part of our the importance of space education today is preparing kids for the growing space economy.
Mm.
The aspirational part is preparing kids for humanity's rapidly approaching multi-planet future. Or to put it more simply, since some of us won't live on planets, preparing students for humanity's future in space. Um, and so that's not just preparing them to be part of the workforce. That's preparing them to grapple with the issues of the day and make ethical decisions, right? And to be moral leaders. So that gets much more interesting. But the curriculum dives into all of those issues as well, looking at alternative forms of governance, looking at sustainability issues, looking at the state of space law and where it needs to get, looking at things like militarization of space. So these are things that, sort of like ordinary political science, for instance, an informed citizenry needs to know about, to be familiar with, and to kind of understand the issues that we're going to be facing. Because we're already in a situation where any kid in the school system today, there's been people in space their entire life.
That's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, the ISS has been permanently crewed for over 20 years. So that's everybody in the public school system today, right? Every kid alive today, their entire lives, there's been people in space. And if you go 10 years out, if all goes well, we're looking at a permanent presence on the moon. We're looking at people having landed on Mars, and we're looking at multiple commercial space stations in continuous operation. So this is no longer 40 years down the road. This is right around the corner. So what are we doing to prepare kids truly for a multi-planet future in space? And so I look at it. I'm certainly, like a lot of people in the field, inspired by stories like Star Trek. But if you look at that as an example, the characters are not just scientists and engineers, though they're good ones. They're often making decisions and using their knowledge of literature and philosophy, if not spirituality, in solving problems and helping each other or helping others. So I think that's a great model for what we should be shooting for. So the curriculum is aspirational in that way. But if you're talking about my career in particular, I think the mission is the focus. But I would love to be involved with, say, something along the lines of a certified space educator program. And whether or not somebody like SpaceX jumps in to do that, or there's an alliance of other space education programs or people who lead those programs, I think there's an opportunity to do something really special that inspires and empowers educators
Mm.
to turn around and help prepare kids for all the things we've been talking about.
Fantastic answer. Well, look, I wish I could chat more, but it's been so great to chat, and maybe we'll get you back on the podcast at some point in the future.
Well, that
Um,
sounds great, Ben. Thanks for all the time.
Thank you very much, Mark.